There is a monster in the Cars universe. Not a villain, not a bad guy with attitude and a rivalry subplot. A monster, something that should not exist. Something that the people who built this world quietly buried in a short film most fans have already forgotten. His name is Frankenwagon's monster. Most people think he's just a silly joke, a one-off gag for little kids, a big green truck stitched together with crane parts, stomping around a wrestling ring for laughs, before Mater and Lightning McQueen figure out how to beat him and everyone goes home happy. That is not what he is. The dark truth is that Frankenwagon's monster is not one car, he is dozens of them. Every dead machine whose parts were stripped and forced together without consent. A walking graveyard. And the evidence scattered across this entire franchise, evidence that nobody ever thought to connect points to something so much larger and so much more disturbing than a monster truck show. Here is the question I need you to sit with for the next 30 minutes. If the cars in this universe are alive genuinely, biologically, psychologically alive, what happens to the identity of a car when it dies? Where does it go? And what happens when someone takes those dead pieces and stitches them back together into something new? Does the old consciousness die? Or does it just get trapped? Let's start with the world itself, because most people wildly underestimate how much infrastructure this franchise quietly built around us. The Cars universe is not a cartoon backdrop. It is a fully functioning society with governments, wars, intelligence agencies, and black budgets. We know this because the franchise shows us all of it. Skipper Riley the Vought, 4U Corsair in Radiator Springs, flew combat missions in the Pacific theater of World War II. He watched his entire squadron get shot down. He survived. He came home. He spent decades barely leaving his hangar, and when he finally did fly again in Cars 3, the weight of that trauma was visible in every single frame. This world went through a Second World War. Real losses, real death, real machines that never came home from places like the Pacific Theater, the Guadalcanal campaign, the brutal attrition battles that turned entire squadrons into wreckage on the ocean floor. Think carefully about what that means for the generals who ran that war. In a world where every soldier is an expensive, complex, conscious machine, not a cheap biological body that can be replaced with a recruitment poster, but a precision-engineered organism with years of training locked inside its engine, the cost of losing one is catastrophic. You cannot draft a replacement. Each soldier took years and enormous resources to build, to think, to develop a personality and a tactical mind. When one dies, that is not just a loss of life. That is a loss of irreplaceable hardware. And every general who understood that would have been driven to the same terrifying question. How do you build a soldier you cannot lose? We have direct evidence from the Cars lore that transplanting a car's engine carries its personality into a new body, which means the engine is roughly equivalent to the combined heart and brain of a car. The personality travels with it. The self is in the hardware. Once you understand that, the military answer to that question becomes obvious and horrifying. You collect the dead. You take the engines of fallen soldiers, the transmissions, the hydraulic systems, the structural components, the parts that still carry neural signatures and mechanical memory and trained combat reflexes, and you rebuild. Not one soldier, many soldiers, all at once, fused into a single body that cannot be stopped by conventional means because it has no single point of failure. Kill one engine and 3 more keep it running. Destroy the front axle, and the crane arms reroute the load. You cannot break a thing that is already broken and reassembled and broken again. This is what the research underlying this theory calls the doctrine of the immortal super soldier. And Dr. Frankenwagon was not a hobbyist. He was not a garage eccentric who happened to like building big trucks. His base model is a Smart 4U, a tiny compact vehicle platform. His classification in every available database lists his core ability as creating life. Not engineering, not mechanics, not demolition. Creating life. That is not the language of a mechanic tinkering in a shed. That is the language of a government researcher with a clearance level and a budget. Now look at where the monster's parts actually came from. Excavators, crane lifters, heavy haulers, the kinds of machinery found on military bases, on construction sites that serve military infrastructure, on the exact category of battlefield where heavy industry and organized conflict overlap. The monster is built on a Peterbilt 362 frame, a long-haul heavy hauler, painted green, military green. Nothing about that color is accidental. In the Cars universe, color is consistent with function. Racing cars are bright. Road workers are muted. Emergency vehicles carry the right markings. A military green monster truck assembled from military-adjacent heavy machinery does not wander into a wrestling ring by coincidence. The wrestling ring itself is cover. Think about it. What better field test environment exists for a combat prototype than a controlled arena where the target is actively trying to destroy you? The crowd is watching and entertained, and any malfunction can be written off as part of the show. You get live combat data. You get stress testing under pressure in front of witnesses who will never believe what they actually saw because they paid for the spectacle. You get to find out whether fusing multiple consciousness-carrying parts into a single body destabilizes under sustained load. And the agencies watching were real. CHROME, the British Intelligence Service, confirmed to exist within the cars. Two Storyline operates in exactly this space. They gather intelligence on technology threats. They run field operatives across international territory. They work with partners to identify risks posed by rogue technology actors. Their presence in the same narrative universe as Dr. Frankenwagon is not a coincidence of franchise building. It is the same story told from two different angles. One side is the experiment, the other side is the agency watching to see whether the experiment worked. And they had very specific reason to be watching. Sergeant the Army Jeep running a surplus store in Radiator Springs is one of the most quietly alarming background characters in this entire franchise. On the surface, he is a cranky veteran stocking shelves. Look closer. He stocks night vision equipment. He stocks field-grade survival kits with enough supplies to endure what he publicly calls the next World War. At the World Grand Prix, he had the tactical intelligence to recognize the signature of an electromagnetic pulse weapon, a technology that should be completely outside the knowledge base of a small-town shopkeeper, and he swapped out Lightning McQueen's fuel with Fillmore's organic compound, specifically because he knew it would be immune to the EMP. A veteran running a desert surplus store does not know how to counter classified directed energy weapons unless he has active security clearance. Sergeant knew about the Frankenwagon project, not because he was part of it, because he was one of the people quietly building a resistance to what it represented. When the arena floor collapsed and the monster disappeared into the chaos below the ring, the official story was that it was gone, destroyed, done, over. But government projects do not end because a prototype falls through a floor. The first public field test of the immortal super soldier was complete, and every analyst who was watching learned exactly what they needed to know. That explains the machine's physical construction. But here is where the real horror lives, and this is the part that nobody in 30 years of Cars analysis has ever connected to what we just established. In this universe, cars are not machines the way a toaster is a machine. The leading biological framework for understanding consciousness in the Cars universe is called the homunculus theory, the idea that inside every car's metal body there is a biological core, a rudimentary organic mind grown in amniotic conditions and permanently fused with the mechanical frame. This is why car doors are never opened. The door is not a panel, it is a skull. What is inside is not a steering wheel and some seats, it is organs. If that framework is correct, and the behavioral, anatomical, and narrative evidence across the franchise consistently supports it, then a car's brain is distributed between two primary centers. The cabin, functioning like the skull and prefrontal cortex, handles conscious thought, personality, speech, and social behavior. The engine, functioning like the heart fused with the limbic system, stores deep memory, emotional baseline, and identity continuity. That second point is the one that matters here, so let it land. The engine stores identity. We have documented this in the franchise. When Lightning McQueen's engine is placed in a road roller's chassis, the personality transfers completely. The body is wrong, the face is wrong, everything external is foreign, but the mind, the specific individual who is Lightning McQueen, is still there, trapped inside hardware that does not belong to it, experiencing a body that does not fit. Now apply that principle to what Dr. Frankenwagon actually built. The monster is not assembled from spare parts. It is assembled from machines that were once alive and conscious. Each crane segment, each excavator arm, each drive shaft and hydraulic piston came from something that had a name, a personality, a history, a death. And the death is the important part, because this is where a real-world phenomenon enters the theory and makes it so much worse. In clinical transplant medicine, there is a documented phenomenon called cellular memory. It is controversial and not universally accepted, but the case studies are real and numerous. A significant percentage of organ transplant recipients in some studies, as high as 1 in 5, report personality changes, new food preferences, unfamiliar emotional responses, and in the most disturbing cases, sensory patterns that match the final moments of their donor's life. One documented case involves a recipient who developed an overwhelming, specific fear of water they had never experienced before, a fear that matched exactly how their donor died. The cells remember. Now scale that to a world where the cells are mechanical, where the memory is not chemical but electromagnetic, where the material itself, the metal, the rubber, the coolant lines, has been under load-bearing stress for years, has carried current, has functioned as part of a thinking system for decades. In metallurgy, this is not theory. Metal fatigue preserves a record of every stress pattern the material has experienced. A steel beam that has held weight under vibration for 20 years carries that history in its molecular structure. The deformation is not random. It is a record. Apply both of those concepts, organic cellular memory and mechanical magnetic memory, to the parts inside the monster, and what you are describing is not a single consciousness trapped in a large body. You are describing a parliament of the dead. Every engine fragment is fighting for control of the central processor. Every hydraulic line is carrying pressure patterns learned in service of a different machine's intentions. The cabin, the skull, the seat of conscious thought belongs to the base Peterbilt 362. But the Peterbilt is receiving signals from a dozen different engine blocks, all of which have their own history, their own trauma, their own last memory before they were torn apart and brought here. And some of those last memories are violent. Construction machines do not retire gently. They fail catastrophically. They collapse, are caught in structural disasters, have pieces sheared off under load while still partially functional. That last moment of sensation is in the metal. And the monster's central processor is being hit by all of it, all the time. Simultaneously, not as a memory it can process and set aside, but as a continuous incoming signal the brain cannot filter because it is coming from the body itself. This is called somatic dissociation in psychological terms. It is when the body sends signals the mind cannot integrate. In humans, it produces panic, depersonalization, fugue states, and in severe cases, a complete fracture of the self into competing identities. The mind splits because the signals it is receiving from its own nervous system do not correspond to any coherent reality. The monster does not roar because it is intimidating. It roars because it is in agony. Watch the monster's behavior in the wrestling ring carefully. It does not strategize. It does not respond to commands in a consistent way. It escalates and repeats destructive patterns that make no tactical sense. It enters frenzied states where the violence seems directed inward as much as outward. These are not the behaviors of a disciplined military prototype. These are the behaviors of a mind being torn apart by competing inputs, every dead machine inside it screaming for the central processor to recognize its memory as the real one, while the Peterbilt's cabin drowns in all of it at once. The cry of, "It's alive," when the monster first appears in the arena, is not just a Frankenstein reference for the children in the audience. In the context of this universe, that phrase has a specific and terrible meaning. It means the cellular memory activated the distributed consciousness of all those dead machines woke up simultaneously and found itself sharing one body. "It's alive" is not a triumphant announcement. It is a horror-stricken observation. Something that should be dead is alive. Multiple somethings. All of them at once. Dr. Franken Wagon did not build a soldier. He built a prison for the dead, and the prisoners are rioting. That tells you everything about what happened inside the monster's mind. If you think the psychological horror of a walking graveyard is the darkest part of this story, brace yourself. That was just the symptom. Now, we need to talk about the disease, but there is still one question that nobody has asked, the question that connects all of this to something so much bigger that when I first worked it out, I had to sit with it for a while before I believed it myself. Who authorized this? Who funded it? And why does the monster look the way it does, built on the same Peterbilt chassis as a very specific corporate vehicle you have almost certainly already seen in this franchise? By and large, B&L. You know them from Wall-E, the corporation that fed humanity into a cycle of passive consumption so complete and so total that the planet choked on its own garbage and every human being had to evacuate to a cruise ship in orbit. B&L ran the news networks. B&L ran the government. B&L built the robots that were supposed to clean up after them, and then quietly issued a directive telling those robots to never come home. Because they ran the government, they effectively absorbed the military-industrial complex. All that surviving military hardware from the war, all those classified clearance levels, they became B&L corporate property. That story takes place in the future. That story takes place in the future. But B&L's history goes back much further than most people realize. The presence of B&L infrastructure in the Cars universe is not subtle if you know what to look for. B&L Raceway, B&L batteries. The branding threads through the world quietly, the way real corporate infrastructure does in the background, on signs, on sponsor boards, so constant and familiar that you stop noticing it. By and large was embedded in the Cars world long before the ecological collapse that sent humanity to the axiom. Here is the timeline that connects all of this. Humanity eventually abandons Earth. They leave behind a planet full of machines, cars, trucks, planes, construction equipment that have been developing something like consciousness for years, fed by AI technology that B&L itself embedded in commercial products to make them more autonomous and more appealing to lazy consumers. B&L wanted their products to think for themselves, so customers would not have to. They succeeded far beyond any reasonable expectation. The machines woke up. When the humans left, the cars were the dominant living agents on the surface, and they built a civilization using the infrastructure that was already there, the civilization we see in the Cars films, while the finite fossil fuel supply held out. BNL did not abandon this. BNL left behind a problem that directly threatened its long-term asset value. The planet was covered in non-recyclable waste. Heavy machinery was rusting in massive junkyards. Industrial infrastructure was deteriorating, and BNL, watching from orbit on the Axiom with shareholders to answer to, needed the planetary surface to remain viable for eventual return. Enter Operation Cleanup, the plan to deploy millions of WALL-E units to compact the waste and restore atmospheric conditions. 5 years maybe, easy. Except there was a problem with the WALL-E solution that became obvious almost immediately in the engineering phase. Standard-size compaction robots are not capable of demolishing large-scale industrial infrastructure. They handle domestic waste. They cannot handle a 40-story crane, a collapsed highway overpass, or a fleet of decommissioned heavy haulers. For that level of work, you need something much larger, much stronger, and, critically, something that does not require manufacturing from scratch using new, expensive materials that have to be shipped from orbit. What if you could use the waste itself? What if you could build the demolition system out of decommissioned heavy machinery, using the dead machines on site as raw material for something capable of the kind of industrial-scale clearance that WALL-E units never could? This is the engineering logic behind the Franken Wagon project. Look at the monster's body as an engineer, not as a viewer watching a wrestling match. A Peterbilt 362 frame, the same platform used by Jerry, the BNL recycler truck, who appears in the franchise as a corporate utility vehicle, as the base chassis. Excavator arms for demolition reach. Crane lift components for vertical clearance and structural removal. Hydraulic systems rated for load-bearing work that dismantles buildings. The monster is not randomly assembled. Every component has a specific industrial utility function. This is not a combat prototype. This is a macro demolition prototype. The Franken Wagon project was BNL's R&D answer to a precise engineering question. Can we build a self-sustaining, self-repairing industrial demolition unit using reclaimed material from the planet's surface, capable of large-scale infrastructure clearance without requiring us to manufacture new heavy equipment from orbit? The answer, in one critical way, was yes. In almost every other way, it was catastrophically no. The problem BNL's engineers did not adequately model was exactly what we spent the last section establishing. The cars on Earth were not machines in the industrial sense anymore. They were alive. Their parts carried memory, identity, and psychological continuity at the component level. When you stripped an excavator's engine and integrated it into a new chassis, you were not integrating a part. You were integrating a person, or the remnant of one. The psychological architecture of what became the Franken Wagon monster was never in the engineering specs, because nobody had correctly mapped the relationship between car components and car consciousness, and the prototype went active, exhibiting what the internal BNL research documents would have classified as severe behavioral anomalies: aggression without strategic logic, destructive cycling, complete inability to receive or process directives. The demolition tool was consuming other machines rather than debris, attacking everything in patterns that looked less like programmed behavior and more like a sustained psychological breakdown. The project was shut down, not officially decommissioned, not documented and archived, but shut down in the way you shut something down when the paperwork would be more dangerous than the secret itself. The monster was cut loose. Dr. Frankenwagon was stripped of his BNL affiliation and allowed to drift into the margins of car society, where the wrestling circuit absorbed the monster's violence and the audience just thought it was entertainment. Destroy the evidence. Make it a show. Let everyone laugh. And BNL turned hard in a different direction. If complex, adaptive, potentially self-rebuilding AI systems inevitably developed into uncontrollable chimeras, if the Frankenwagon problem was not a bug, but a fundamental feature of machine consciousness, then the solution was radical standardization. No more diversity, no more adaptive systems, no more machines capable of integrating foreign components. Every WALL-E unit identical, every Eve unit identical, security robots, cleaning robots, the autopilot standardized, locked, directive-bound. No self-modification, no learning beyond operational parameters, no components that can carry memory of a previous identity. The thing BNL feared most in the Frankenwagon prototype, the adaptive self-assembly, the integration of dead machine components. The emergent behavior from fused consciousness was eliminated from every subsequent design. And here is the brutal irony that this franchise buries in plain sight. and that I have been thinking about ever since I worked all of this out. The only robot who survived 700 years on the abandoned surface of Earth was Wall-E, one unit out of millions. The reason Wall-E survived, the reason his identity persisted, his curiosity persisted, his capacity for emotional attachment persisted, is that Wall-E spent 7 centuries doing exactly what Frankenwagon did. He collected, he integrated, he took parts from deactivated Wall-E units and used them to repair and sustain himself. He practiced continuously the principle of Frankensteining, the forbidden methodology that BNL spent decades trying to eliminate from machine life. The survival strategy that saved life on Earth was the same strategy that created the monster BNL spent decades trying to erase. So here is what you actually watched in that short film. You watched a military prototype built from the dead machines of a world that had been through a real war. You watched the failed experiment of a corporation that was already building the infrastructure for a planetary evacuation. You watched a creature that could not tell its own mind apart from the screaming memories of the dozens of machines it was assembled from. You were told it was a wrestling match. At the start of this, I asked you, if the cars in this universe are genuinely alive, if consciousness lives in their engines and memory lives in their metal, what happens to that identity when the car dies? Does it end? Or does it get trapped in whatever the next owner does with the parts? The answer this universe gives you is the worst possible one. It gets trapped, it stays, it screams, and it fights every other trapped identity for control of a body they all share and none of them wanted. Dr. Frankenwagon did not build a monster truck. He built a mass grave that learned to walk. The wrestling crowd cheered. Nobody in the stands understood what was happening in that arena. They saw a big green truck slamming into things and thought it was a show. They did not hear what the monster was actually saying when it roared. They did not understand that the creature begging for its own destruction was not performing. And when it fell through that floor, when the arena collapsed and the monster disappeared, the crowd went home satisfied. The experiment was still running. It always was. If this theory changed how you look at the Cars universe, leave a like to feed the algorithm. And if you want to see how deep the rabbit hole goes in other animated worlds, click the video on your screen right now. The truth is always darker.